a sequel to one of my favorite RTS games of all time, but taking place in a bigger, badder Eastern Front setting between the Russians and Germans. Oh hell yeah, can't wait to see how it will surpass the first game. Oh. So World War II is kind of my thing. Not in the horrors of war or the death toll of civilians, which is heartbreaking sincerely. No, I mean in the sense of spectacles and big battles. Like, isn't that why kids have always been drawn to toy soldiers, playing with guns, and power fantasies in general? Anyway, I was 8 years old when I was exposed to the History Channel. In turn, that exposed me to World War II films, books, and especially games. Though I don't think I played much World War II strategy games, but in 2006 I came across a game that would change everything I knew and enjoyed about RTS games. And that was Company of Heroes.
First squad is at the shingle.
It completely changed what I saw could be the future of RTS games, simplifying or ditching archaic RTS conventions to focus on tactical combat while just looking and sounding amazing. Then it was announced in 2012, 6 years after the game first came out, that a full-on sequel to the big hit series was on its way. With the setting being notorious for being the largest confrontation in history, it pitted tens of millions of men in a brutal, ferocious clash at a scale never seen on the Western Front. Obviously this was going to be a very ambitious sequel given the size and scope, but the developer, Relic, has a proven track record in delivering ambitious titles. So when the reviews came out, it was surprising to see the less than glowing reception the sequel got compared to the first game. IGN's reviewer calling the game more sequel-sized expansion than a true successor. Company of Heroes 2 repeats many of the original Coast feats, now on the Eastern Front. Several outlets and fans echoing the same statement. Some are quite critical of the changes and additions, which they found to be downgrades from the first game, and just choices that were confusing. Company of Heroes pretty much changed how I consume RTS games. In fact, I even struggled with enjoying franchises like Command & Conquer after being exposed to Company of Heroes. Why is that? Well, Company of Heroes did away with a lot of traditions. Rather than focusing on building your bases, gathering resources, and sending large armies to crash into one another in a splashy display of explosions and chaos. The game instead opted to focus on limited base building, capturing points on the map that auto-generates resources, as well as these victory points that gradually drains the enemy till they run out. But most importantly, the game's biggest innovation was centered around authentic squad tactics. Using cover, flanking, and even auto-retreating units from being wiped out to save them really did set this game apart from everyone else. It made for an authentic experience and encouraged you to preserve a unit for its combat experience. And it created a sense of intimacy to your units as they progressively got stronger. There's a lot of nice touches the original game had, like how explosions could create craters for units to use as cover. Individual squad members would actually try and find their own cover, which, while it didn't work all the time, it's still impressive for 2006 and even today. And did I mention how amazing the production values were? They later released 2 expansion packs that added 2 new factions and a lot of missions. I haven't finished campaigns yet, but yeah, the game had a good amount of support, especially modding. Heck, the modders even put out stuff like the Eastern Front mod before Company of Heroes 2 was released. Following Company of Heroes 1, Relic focused on the Dawn of War series, putting out Dawn of War 2, which was a radical departure from the first game in that you primarily focused on heroes and squad tactics, including RPG mechanics such as leveling up. Some fans felt these things were too much of a change from the first game, which was more of a traditional RTS, but overall the sequel was quite well received. So with Company of Heroes 2 being announced, it was promised that we'd see the titanic struggle between 2 colossal powers. In June 2013, after facing delays and exchanging one publisher for another, and while the game still got good reviews, it was a significant drop from what a landmark game Company of Heroes 1 was. There'll be some who suggest that it's somewhat unfair to hold a sequel to such a high expectations, because not every sequel has to reinvent the wheel. And yes, not every sequel has to be revolutionary, but maybe evolutionary instead. But of course, in the end, what really matters is how well executed the final product is, right? You follow Isakovich,
Lev Abramovich.
who witnesses not just the Germans' ruthlessness, but also from his own side.
Fire!
The story switches back and forth between his World War II days and in the 50s while he's interned at a Gulag for spreading so-called harmful propaganda. Churkin, a colonel you served in the war, travels to Siberia, disappointed in your disloyalty and arrest. The game frames the two characters as being ideologically opposed to one another.
When did you begin to lose faith in the cause? When we first met, you were a true believer.
In my men. I always believed in them.
Churkin believing the sacrifices were necessary to defeat the Germans, while Isakovich in turn strongly disagrees. Stretching from 1941 to 1945, you not only fight off the Germans but also watch helplessly as the Soviet leadership brutally treats its own men, including gunning down your men to executing an entire battalion for saving Isakovich from capture?
That is no excuse for deserting your post.
After Berlin's taken, Isakovich is arrested after trying to get his stories published in the West. As you're about to be executed by a guard, Churkin kills the guards and tells you to escape and publish your journals in the West as he's finally won over by Isakovich's arguments.
You'd better go now, comrade.
As you're sneaking out, Churkin, racked with guilt for having so many die under his command, no longer can live with himself and commits suicide.
I've earned the bullet. The least I deserve is to choose which bullet. So, I'll take yours. The stories of our brave soldiers need to be told.
While the story is incredibly flawed, I have to give the game a big kudos for at least trying to say something. Unlike the first Company of Heroes, it has a message and a perspective it wants to tell. It clearly has a message about how the Soviet High Command poorly mistreated its own men, and yeah, I actually lean towards the idea. Inflexibility plagued the Soviet army. Soldiers and lower-ranking officers were harshly punished for acting outside of their superiors' orders, which no doubt led to catastrophic and unnecessary losses throughout the war. Sadly, the way it's portrayed is incredibly ham-fisted, and devolves into recycling stereotypes and tropes that solely serve to make Isakovich the rational one, while Churkin cartoonishly wrong.
There is no retreat, not one step back. By Order 227, anyone who retreats will be shot on the spot, executed as a coward and a traitor.
Perhaps the enemy should save their bullets. Just let us shoot each other.
Isakovich is just too self-righteous. One mission in and he's clearly against all the needless slaughter from the Soviet High Command.
At what cost? You were always willing to sacrifice so many brave men. Were their lives really so cheap?
I did not have the luxury to agonize over every soldier I sent to die.
Had he started out as a naive officer who tries to justify the losses but gradually can't and starts criticizing his superiors, then he probably would have been a more compelling and proactive character. I'm not even sure why he doesn't start out as a journalist. It's not like Isakovich, while he's an officer, disobeys his superiors. He could have easily just followed other officers and soldiers around as a war correspondent and sickened by the poor leadership. It feels like a missed opportunity that we never covered several different perspectives on the ground like snipers, tank crews, penal soldiers, partisans, and more. While the first Company of Heroes never tackled big ideas, the game involved a lot more faces from paratroopers to rangers to even pilots, with the expansion packs adding in the British and German officers, then finally more paratroopers and the German Tiger tank crew. It just made the original Company of Heroes feel more intimate and had me rooting for them, and I never felt that with Company of Heroes 2. It really makes me wonder if Relic didn't think it was necessary to see more characters and a perspective from the soldiers, or did they just not have the time and budget to do those things. In any case, the story is poorly written, none of the cast is likable, and the messages are just dumbed down to such an extent it felt ridiculous.
Nothing personal.
And this is coming from someone who actually agrees with the overall message, on paper anyway. I'm I'm gonna get this out of the way and say that most RTS campaigns I've played have been rather boring. What's my beef with RTS campaigns? Well, most of them feel uninspired. Most games rely on the traditional RTS structure of base building, gathering resources, and sending large armies towards one another. Rinse and repeat. Granted, some games do manage to avoid these problems, or excel in these traditions. StarCraft 2 comes to mind in having pretty good pacing to its missions, while glowing in areas like interesting mission designs that changes things up and keeps you on your toes, an enthralling story, and high production values. With Company of Heroes 2, the biggest strikes I have against the campaign is the tedious pacing and uninspired mission design, and they're both intertwined really. Many missions center around destroying the enemy's base, or capturing a point at the other end of the map, and well, there's just no tension. You can't really fail. Maybe the enemy will send an attack every once in a while, but it's just a small token force at best. There's nothing really at stake. Losing units doesn't change anything, and because you're given all the time in the world, you just wait for resources and rebuild your units and try attacking again. There's defensive missions where you hold out, so there's some agency, but the enemy AI is so passive and mindless that it just undercuts the tension. Especially since the Germans aren't associated with poorly led assaults, unless it's like late war Germany. Plus it's irksome that no matter how well you do, you're forced back and have to withdraw to the rear lines because of the off-map artillery or planes, which just feels so scripted. With offensive missions, I think a simple change could really solve the pacing problems in Company of Heroes 2. Make them timed missions. Why? Well, it just helps create a sense of agency that's lacking in the campaign. As for defensive missions, maybe just limit you to a finite amount of units that you have to preserve, as in once your units die, you won't be able to call in new ones. I mean, ideally having the AI actually be able to properly assault your positions would be great, but it seems like AI is so hard to nail down that I'm not sure you could do that. There's 2 missions in this campaign I'd consider actually well made. One where you try and save Isakovich from the Germans, and it starts with you having 5 minutes to get to him, then another 5 minutes of you defending the area from a vicious German counterattack. Thus this mission showing that a simple time limit can elevate the mission to something more thrilling, at least for me. There's one last mission that I feel was the best in the campaign. It basically was you and your infantry going up against a Tiger tank. Yep, a German Tiger tank. With only your infantry barely equipped with anti-tank weapons, and best of all, finite units. Yeah, how's that for stressful? Unfortunately, this mission has been left broken since 2015 because of a multiplayer patch. When you play this mission now, the Tiger tank has a crippled engine that makes it move at such a slow speed. It's just baffling how this hasn't been fixed for 4 years now, or why it even happened in the first place.
Wait, come on. Come on. Oh, he blocked the mine. Come on. Gotcha.
It's also weird how the standout Blizzard mechanics only shows up in like one mission. And that one mission is very early on. I know it wasn't snowing in Berlin during the battle in 1945, but it makes me wonder if Relic should have had Company of Heroes 2 solely focused on the Stalingrad front. The first half taking place in a hot Russian summer, and the second half taking place during the winter, and thus being able to make use of the Blizzard mechanics and all. What's also a bit disappointing is that while the campaign spans from 1941 to 1945, the two armies are kinda stuck between 1941 and 1943. There's no Volkssturm, King Tigers, or any late war units from the Eastern Front. They just recycle the same units from the mid-war period for the entire campaign. Lastly, something I never truly understood was the conscript system. In the campaign, you can call in free soldiers instantly, and the more they die, the better units you can call in later. That seems to reward bad play and just makes no sense at all. There's literally no reason to not use them because they're just free and they eventually become stronger the more you throw away. And I'm just wondering, what's it trying to say? That the Soviets were careless with lives? But why reward you with better units then? Honestly, I'd just get rid of the whole reward and tie the system with the timed mission conditions. Isakovich and the player, feeling the stress of a time limit, is pressured to throw away units in a costly but arguably necessary assaults or a last stands. Now you and Isakovich has a genuine reason to throw away units, even if you morally disagree with it. Plus, given the catastrophic counterattacks ordered by Stalin early in the war, or the race to Berlin, it makes sense to run against the clock, regardless of how many men you sacrifice. There's also the Theater of War mode that offers solo or online missions, and while some are nice and unique, like defending a bridge with limited amounts of partisans and their abilities, most missions do boil down to destroying enemy's base or holding the VP. Also, some of the balancing is broken in this mode, so yeah, not every mission's worth playing now. But overall, the campaign just feels like they didn't know how best to use the Company Heroes formula and how to make the campaign and the systems more interesting or at least entertaining. And come on Relic, fix a 4-year-old bugged mission already, please? Having Code 2 set in the Eastern Front meant a lot of things, or at least it should. We tend to associate the Eastern Front with being far more bloodier and brutal than the Western Front. The gap and differences between the Red Army and the German Wehrmacht, and just the nature of the titanic conflict, posed a lot of opportunities for Relic to play with. Even if it meant dipping into historical myths that sadly was perpetuated by ex-German generals and Cold War propaganda. Either way, Relic wanted to capture the iconography and elements of the Eastern Front, and the results are mixed. Oh, they definitely were able to make the Germans feel superior to the Soviets in terms of quality, but other than that, while the Soviets are portrayed as quantity over quality, unsurprisingly, part of me feels like that's actually not that pronounced enough. In fact, if you divide the highest amounts of troops deployed by both sides in 1943 and 1944, the ratio would be around 1 to 2 for the Germans and Soviets respectively. But in Company of Heroes 2, the numerical advantage isn't really portrayed in the game, especially multiplayer. Both sides more or less have the same amount of units on the battlefield. The Soviets may have a couple more units, but yeah, it seems to be tied for the most part. I guess you could argue that the Soviets can maybe recover from losses a bit better, but given that the game has a veterancy system, it means the winning units, usually the German side, will have a clear advantage over fresh new units from the Soviet side. So, kind of a snowball situation here. The weaker Soviet faction requires more micro and is harder to get into, whereas the Germans' units are far more durable and deal out more damage. They play more defensively too, which is more popular with the average player. There's also some odd faction design for the Soviets, like how the penal troops started out as an assault unit meant to attack in close quarters and strongpoints with flamethrowers, semiotic weapons, and a satchel charge. But players complained that going for penals meant that you weren't getting anti-tank weapons to counter early German tanks and vehicles. And even though there is a light anti-tank cannon in the campaign, and through a specific niche commander, Relic decided to give these penal troops, disgraced men meant to sacrifice themselves in suicidal attacks, anti-tank rifles? Yeah, that doesn't feel in character at all. I also think the Soviet faction should be able to upgrade their conscripts and engineers into different units, which I think makes thematic sense. Conscript squads that perform well should be able to upgrade into elite guards units for long-range engagements, or maybe even penals for close-range suicidal assaults. I don't know, I just find it weird how conscripts can level up but never center anything greater meaningfully. Which would have been more fitting given the transformation from a broken, poorly organized Red Army in the early war to a battle-hardened Soviet steamroller by 1943. Meanwhile, maybe the Germans could start out as being the crack mobile juggernaut it was in the early war, but over the course of the match they started relying on Axis reserves and less experienced German reinforcements and go on the defensive as their sap of strength. The decision to go with dozens of different commanders than 3 doctrines per faction like in the original game also seems like a big step backwards, ironically. I guess Relic wanted to offer player choices and basically monetize the game, but the reality is that there's just generals using overlapping abilities and units, or they're just insignificant. Whereas with Company of Heroes 1, instead of having commanders, they only had 3 doctrines per faction, and they felt like they were well defined. Not only did they have clear titles, but their abilities and units all mattered and thematically matched their doctrines. For example, the German faction has a Terror Doctrine that gave you access to V1 rocket bombs, the King Tiger, and other demoralizing abilities. Meanwhile, in Company of Heroes 2, you have commanders like Strategic Reserves, who gets Assault Grenadiers, Smoke Grenades, Pioneers who can throw satchel charges, and a Tiger Ace? How do they exactly relate to being part of some Strategic Reserves? But yeah, when it comes to multiplayer, there's way too much in terms of balancing and faction design to cover. And I haven't covered the other 3 factions, but briefly, the Americans lack artillery by default, as do the British. The British also play too defensively despite being on offensive historically. And the new German faction, the OKW, is just a power creeping mess. There's also the Blizzard feature, which already was used only once in the campaign. At one point was a big selling point for the multiplayer. A blizzard occurring every several minutes that would obscure vision and kill units who weren't near any bonfire? That's awesome. It created a lot of tactical and strategic opportunities for you to prepare for or exploit. Maybe you use it to recover from the previous fighting, or maybe you launch a surprise assault during the blizzard. So it really sucks that Relic eventually removed the blizzard mechanic because apparently people said it wasn't competitive enough or too punishing or whatever. You can't even play it offline anymore. Lastly, I'll say that it's kind of odd that despite the change of scenery from the first game, the actual combat feels pretty much unchanged from the first Company of Heroes. In a way, I feel like they could have done something drastic like how Dawn of War 2 was a drastic change from the first game in scale and scope.
On to the next target, brothers.
Maybe with Code 2, the battles could have been more pulled out and large scale to reflect the massive Eastern Front compared to the Western Front. And with that, I'd argue sacrificing some aspects to make the large-scale battles work. But in exchange for less small-scale tactics, we'd see more units on the battlefield, with more tanks and infantry battles that were iconic of the setting. It is kind of funny how the first Company of Heroes felt more macro than micro intensive somewhat. Also funnily enough, the Steel Division games did a great job of transitioning from Normandy to the Eastern Front, the sequel focusing on even bigger, massive battles than the first. Nevertheless, given the shift to the Eastern Front and what we tend to associate with it, it's rather disappointing that Relic didn't go far enough with the additions and changes for the sequel, even backtracking on a really cool feature. And we've seen Relic take bold decisions before with the Dawn of War sequel, so it's just deflating to see them not take advantage of the Titanic setting for the sequel. Relic got quite a decent bit of flack for its portrayal of the Eastern Front, not because of them glorifying the Nazis or anything truly deplorable, but because several Russians and others kinda take issue with the slanted view of the Soviet perspective, criticizing the game for recycling inaccuracies and I guess stereotypes about how Russians were ruthless. And on one hand, while I agree that seeing the same old Russians killing each other and so on is tired, I will say that I am not against being liberal with history if it has a point and it's told well. I already said this, but while I agree with the message that too many Soviets were butchered due to recklessness and terrible leadership, there just aren't really any characters to attach to. Every character is pretty shallow in one note. I mean, as historically inaccurate as Enemy at the Gates was, which inspired Call of Duty and Company of Heroes 2 and more, at least we got some compelling, likable characters.
We're famous in the city. Khrushchev loved the article. He's promoted me to the general staff. And you to sniper division.
Well, that's good.
It's very good.
It's very good. It's great.
It's very great! It's great! It's great! It's for both of us because we did it together. Together. Although, admittedly, I did all the hard work.
Oh, yeah?
You know, you're very lucky I can't fight back.
Why's that?
and showed the heroism demonstrated by the frontline soldiers. And it was clear who the villains were in the film. Unlike Company of Heroes 2, where the Germans don't really commit any atrocities, even the reveal of the concentration camp is briefly brought up in the game, and the horrors are never shown or put into detail.
After what I saw at Majdanek, I got drunk, and I stayed drunk for days.
Yes, you were becoming useless to me.
Useless? Do you even understand how it felt to see that? On top of everything else?
But yeah, I understand Relic wanting to portray the Soviets as the underdogs. I mean, we love our David versus Goliath story. It's why a lot of World War II media portrays the Germans as at least technically superior in weapons and training, but are defeated by the courage of the Allied war effort. Granted, the reality was that a lot of German divisions were often under-equipped with weapons, vehicles, and tanks, and with the quality of officers and soldiers degrading too as the war progressed. I mean, fun fact, only about 30 Tiger tanks were present in the Western Front, yet media and some historians tend to over-exaggerate its presence and effectiveness. Why? Because we love the idea of underdogs going up against a superior enemy. Back to Company of Heroes 2, Quinn Duffy, the game's director, said that the team read as many books and perspectives and wanted to demonstrate the desperation and ruthlessness faced by the common Soviet soldier. But without any likable characters or focusing so much on the ruthless leadership rather than showing more heroism from the common soldier who risked everything by losing to the Germans, it's no wonder the story feels so unsatisfying or, understandably offensive to certain people. And no, I'm not saying that they should glorify the Soviets in the game. I've seen some of Stalingrad 2013, and yeah, no, I'm not big on war porn either. While Quinn Duffy seems like he had good intentions and I'm fine with artistic liberties being taken, the game just feels too mean-spirited and devoid of any sense of relief or optimism or heroism to contrast with a dour tone, and it's just poorly written. It's not exactly clear who or what specifically and to what extent affected the game's development, release, and post-launch support. While it is easy to claim that it was because of THQ going under before the game released, that the game didn't really deliver like the first game did, Company of Heroes 2 was released just about 6 months after THQ closed down their doors, with Sega now owning the company. So it is possible that THQ, due to its struggling financial issues, gave Relic a smaller and maybe inadequate budget to work with the sequel. I wouldn't know, but that is a possibility. Did Sega also just not invest much into the sequel? Especially given that the original Company of Heroes got 2 expansion packs, dozens of missions for 3 factions with decent production values, while the sequel had only 1 DLC campaign for the American faction? That's also possible. There's 2 things that I think are probable causes. The first thing being that maybe given THQ's deteriorating financial situation, the Company of Heroes 2 was rushed and greenlit to help stave off bankruptcy, thus its budget and scope being less ambitious. But secondly, I think why the sequel feels subpar in places compared to the original is that a lot of the Relic staff in the 2000s seem to have left the company. A handful actually joined Blizzard to work on StarCraft 2 and Diablo 3. And there was a tragic event where one of the leads on the original Company of Heroes expansion packs was fatally injured in a car accident, though fortunately he managed to save his wife and unborn child. There was a lot of hemorrhaging of talent from Relic, and while Quinn Duffy and the producer Greg Wilson are clearly skilled, I can't help but think with THQ's fall, the lack of strong post-launch support from Sega compared to the Total War series gets, and just the company seeming to be rather fractured and a shell of its former self, it just all hints that Company of Heroes 2 had a much more troubled production than the first game, and why maybe this game played things too safe for a sequel. Company of Heroes 2 feels like something between an expansion and a sequel, something that has the right amount of content, new factions, a new campaign, and so on, but never enough new, well-executed ideas. Yes, it's still Company of Heroes and the gameplay is still solid for the most part, and they made several quality of life improvements, Overall though, it just feels too safe and uninspired for what should have been a more thematic Titanic struggle on the Eastern Front and the sequel to a revolutionary critical hit from 2006.
Brave infantry have made the ultimate sacrifice.
But wait, why did I not talk about the multiplayer as much, even though it is probably the only reason to get this game, or even the dynamic DLC campaign that I'd argue is possibly one of my favorite campaigns of all time? Well, this video is called Company Fuels 2 is Confusing, so you're gonna just have to be patient and wait for the next part. See you next time! Thanks for watching, and sorry in advance for the audio quality, awkward editing, and stuff I missed out. I plan on revisiting the game later and learn from my mistakes. I want to give a very special thank you to my best friend, Araxio, for his support and advice, as well as folks from 2 Discord circles I frequent. What's next? I plan on redoing my incredibly flawed first video of The Force Unleashed, so looking forward to doing it right this time.